Hi everyone, I hope you're all having a good week. I am going to get things started here by talking about response paper number 1. So for those of you who are looking to start that paper, hopefully this will help you a little bit more. So I know you can read all of this stuff here. It's due in a couple of weeks, but the things I want to emphasize are, first of all, since the page requirement is only 2 to 3 pages, please make sure that your intro and your conclusion are relatively short. That's something that I see sometimes with students who aren't familiar with how I grade. They end up writing a huge introduction and they don't spend enough time on the body, which is really where I'm grading you. So please make sure that you take note of that. So with this paper, what you're going to be doing is you're going to pick one of the theories that we will have discussed in the next few weeks. You're going to basically summarize that theory, and then you're going to try to show that theory in action in some way or another. So what I want you to try to do is spend about 2 paragraphs on the theory. So maybe spend one of those paragraphs talking about the theory generally, and then the next paragraph being more specific about one part of that theory. And then for the 3 paragraphs, you might use one of those paragraphs to actually describe the example that you're then going to connect to the theory. I'm not going to be picky if there's like more than 2 paragraphs in that first section or more than 3 paragraphs in the second, but what I am going to be picky about is I want you to make sure that you're spending more time on the example section than the plain theory section. So please just take note of that. That's what I'll be looking for. And so you have 2 to 3 pages to do this. A few things that I've given to you as far as suggestions go. If you have no idea how to find an example, you might pick a speech, you might pick an interview, or anything like that that you feel like you could spend a lot of time on. And I would suggest picking a theory that you already know pretty well rather than trying to like fit something in. Don't forget you grade yourself when you submit your paper. That's really important, and make sure that you're using the rubric that I'll show in just a second to do that. The other thing that's really important here is you don't need a reference page, but you must cite the reading in order to get full credit. So don't forget to use the reading for this paper and all the papers that you do in this class. I've scrolled down a bit so you can see the rubric. All of this can be found on Canvas in the Files tab under Assignments. But just to give you an idea, here's what I'm looking for in all of these sections. And you should be using this rubric, like I said, to grade yourself too. All right, so hopefully this is relatively straightforward, but as always, if you have questions, feel free to email me or come to my office hours, and I'm happy to expand on this a little bit more. So with that said, let's go ahead, and I think in this video I'm just going to talk about the ideology reading, and then in the next video I'll talk about the dramatism reading. So I'm going to try to separate them to give myself a little bit of a break. So let me go ahead and share with you here we go, the PowerPoint for today. All right, so today what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to focus a lot on the reading questions that you had so that I can make sure that you know whether you got them right or you're a little bit off. And I'm also going to add a little bit more to your understanding of Althusser's ideology. It's really important for you when you're writing your papers for this class to use these videos to help you expand your understanding of this so that you shouldn't just be using the reading questions to help you write your paper. So hopefully this will help a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about ISAs and RSAs, and they're really important in order for ideology to function. Then I'll talk about hegemony and interpolation, and then finally I'll end by making sure that I talk a little bit about how this relates to other forms of rhetoric. Okay, so let's get started just by clearly explaining what ideology is. So most of you have probably heard this in some of your other classes. The basic definition is a system of ideas and beliefs that help define your goals, your values, etc., etc. So we talk about ideology in a lot of different ways. Sometimes people talk about it in sort of this individual level, like my ideology is different from your ideology. And in today's conversation, we are talking about ideology on a broad scale. So think about this as like, Althusser is talking about an American ideology or a global ideology, something that many of us share, right? And whether we agree or disagree with it, we're still within that ideology. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so now that we've established that, let's go ahead and get into Althusser's theses, which I think a lot of you focused on the first one, but I want to make sure that we have both of them up here. So the first one is ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And the second one is ideology has a material existence. So the way that this is like, I guess, the easiest to understand, and it's pretty complicated the way that he wrote it, but the easiest way to understand this is to think about how we talk about race as a social construction. So that whole idea of race is an imaginary relationship to real things. Right? So that is thesis number one, something like race or gender, or even our understanding of what a chair is, right? All of that is imaginary. But despite it being imaginary, the second thesis says it still has impact, right? So in other words, here we have race as a social construction, but despite the social construction, people of color are being affected by the construction of race, right? And so we have things like mass incarceration. We have people judging different immigrants in different ways depending on their race or ethnicity, right? All of that is that material existence that's a result of something that's imaginary. What Althusser is trying to get us to think about is who is involved in creating these imaginary relationships, right? So how do we come to understand these types of relationships? Of course, it's probably not surprising that the people who are most responsible for these relationships are the people who are in power. But to be honest, at this point, because most ideologies are so old, the people in power probably don't realize how responsible they are for these imaginary relationships. They're sort of just playing along in their role in something that's been created a long time ago. But something that I think helps us better understand how this is functioning, even though most people don't even realize that it's happening, is through the system of ISAs versus RSAs. So Althusser talks about RSAs as repressive state apparatuses and ISAs as ideological state apparatuses. So both of these things are really important, but of course the ISAs are more important for ideology's function. So RSAs are repressive in the way that like a police officer might be, or think about this as like punishment, right? So something that sort of holds you back. ISAs are like the tricky side of things. ISAs are the things that like, sure, they are kind of holding you back, but you don't necessarily realize that they're holding you back. And in fact, you might be okay with them holding you back. So think about this as like when you're maybe a teenager being in like a juvenile hall, which is very repressive, or being in a school, right? A school is an ISA. Juvenile hall is an RSA. Right? So other ISAs are things like the church, right? So we have education, the church, the family, the media, of course, is something that functions as that now. Parts of the government, so depending on which part you're looking at, let's see, we're thinking about political parties, right? Those are functioning as ISAs. And the list goes on and on. But all of these things are working together to sort of create this one ideology. So we learn the same things, or at least similar things, according to Althusser, at home as we do in the workplace, which is another ISA, or in school, et cetera, et cetera. And that helps create these relationships that are imaginary, but still feel really strong, right? And still have impacts on all of us. All right, so ISAs and RSAs might be something that you write about when you're trying to talk a little bit more about what Althusser was trying to say. So let's move forward and talk about hegemony. Hegemony is defined in many different ways, but the way I like to think about this is as a process. So think about it as like a push and pull between people who are in power and people who are not in power, right? And so the people who are not in power are like pushing against the people in power to get the things that they want. And then the people in power pull a little bit from that in order to satisfy the needs of the people who are not in power. And so that maintains their power, right? It maintains their hegemony. Right. So a good example of this, I mean, the list goes on and on, but the one I always like to use is gay marriage. So when gay marriage became the federal, when the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage was something that all states in the United States had to abide by, that was an example of like hegemony working, because that gave the gay community, and maybe, I mean, if we want to be broad about the LGBTQ community, sort of gave them a little bit, right? It threw them like a bone, right? I love dogs, so I'm sorry if you feel like I'm dehumanizing people, but anyways, it threw them a bone. And so it satisfied the needs of many of them, right? So not everyone was happy in the gay community, or of course the LGBTQ community, but it satisfied a lot of them. And so it kept them from like continuing to voice their opinion for a while. And that's how hegemony works. It sort of satisfies enough to keep people down, right? And while that's happening, people on the outside who are not part of the LGBTQ community, but also are not in power, they sort of look at the LGBTQ community and they're like, well, you just got this one thing. Why are you complaining, right? So they shouldn't be complaining after they received that little treat. And so this goes on and on. This is something that's a constant process in order to maintain the power, right? And maintain sort of this system. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Let's get into interpolation. A lot of you got this right as well. He sort of talks about this in a lot of different ways, but think about interpolation in relation to ideology as being folded into or being brought into an ideology. Right? So according to Althusser, we need ideology to avoid alienation. Ideology is something that, like, although we don't know that we're looking for it, without it, we would be lost, especially because everyone else around us would be involved in it. And we would sort of be like, what's going on? He doesn't think that we can function without ideology, right? That's not something that you have to agree with, but that's something that he suggests, right? And he believes that ideology gives us something to sort of do, right? And it satisfies the needs for many of us. Yeah, so if we were to like go against ideology and not have it, as Althusser would be like, that's impossible. The only thing that you could do is change ideology. You can't just like get rid of it completely. So the way that we get folded into this is through interpolation. Althusser tells the story of like a police officer saying, hey, you. The moment that police officer says, hey, you, to you, you are being interpolated into this ideology, right? That probably wouldn't be your first interpolation, right? Interpolation is something that's going to be happening on and on and on. Your first one might be like even before you're born, when your parents have a gender reveal party, right? And so you've already been interpolated as a boy or a girl, and that becomes really complicated when you're interpolated in the wrong way for people who are trans, right? So again, interpolation being folded into ideology. And as we are folded into ideology, we start to understand ourselves based on the way that the people in power have interpolated us. So Althusser talks about this as like, before you're in an ideology, you're an individual, right? So you're sort of existing on your own, you're functioning on your own. Once you're in an ideology, and he would say we're sort of already always in an ideology, you're a subject. So in other words, you are sort of functioning in response to that capital S subject, or the, originally like the king or the queen, but think about this as like the president, or even your professor. They can be capital S subjects that are then making you do the things that they wish for you to do. Right? And typically in class, we talk about like how do we know who our leader is? This is, people who are telling you to do things, you typically figure out that that's our leader, right? The media will tell you who your leader is. The way classrooms are structured typically tells you who your leader is, right? And the way the people in power, the leaders, treat you, you know, positively or negatively, if they recognize you in the proper way, all of those things affect, again, how you see yourself, right? So if they're not calling, for example, just very simply, they're not calling you by the right name. Like if I've constantly called you one name the whole semester, even if you corrected me, or even especially if you corrected me, you're gonna look at yourself differently, especially if I have a lot of power, right? You might say, oh, that means I don't mean a whole lot if this person who has a lot of power can't even recognize who I am, right, properly. All right, so there's a lot more to ideology, and in fact, later on in the semester, we use one of the readings to sort of expand on this idea, especially with this idea of like not being recognized properly. And there are some people who don't believe that we have this one American ideology. I don't actually believe that that's true, but all of that is stuff that we would discuss in class. And I'm happy to like spend some time talking about that in office hours if any of you are interested. So what I really want you to get from this is I want you to understand ISAs, RSAs, make sure that you understand interpolation and hegemony, because all of those things would be really important to write about in maybe your response paper if you were to choose this one. As far as ideology, like one of the reasons we start with this is this relates to every single thing that we'll be talking about throughout the rest of this class, right? If we have one shared ideology, that's going to impact the way that people use rhetoric, right? It's going to impact the way that politicians talk to you, the way that social movements choose to do one thing versus another. So this is something that will come up throughout the rest of the semester. Okay, so hopefully you'll watch the next video on dramatism, but this is it for ideology. Thank you for sticking with me, and perhaps I'll see you in the next video.